You walk past a squirrel almost every single day, and you don't even register it anymore. It scrambles up a tree. It buries something in your yard. It sits on a wire and stares at you like you're the strange one in this arrangement. You've never once thought about eating it. That idea feels almost taboo today, closer to eating a pigeon or a rat than a chicken. But the real answer to why that squirrel is invisible to you as food is far stranger than simple disgust. Less than 100 years ago, that same animal sat on the plate of the President of the United States. Not as a stunt, not as a dare, as his favorite meal, requested by name, cooked from a recipe that ended up printed in an official White House cookbook. So what happened between then and now? For most of American history, the squirrel wasn't vermin. It wasn't a joke, it was dinner, and it was everywhere. Before supermarkets existed, before refrigeration, before a chicken breast arrived wrapped in plastic under fluorescent light. The squirrel was one of the most reliable sources of protein a family in North America could get their hands on. It required no fences, no feed, no land ownership, just a rifle, a little patience, and a forest, which in early America was in almost endless supply. Why did an animal this small end up feeding a nation for 200 years? Because it multiplied faster than almost anything else worth hunting, and because it was so abundant that ignoring it as food would have been the strange choice, not the normal one. In the 1700s, colonial farmers in Pennsylvania didn't think of squirrels as food first. They thought of them as a plague. Squirrels tore through cornfields in numbers that are almost hard to picture now, and the damage was severe enough that colonial governments put an actual price on their heads. The Swedish botanist Per Kalm, sent by the Royal Swedish Academy of Sciences to study the natural resources of the American colonies, recorded that in a single year in the mid-1700s, the colony of Pennsylvania paid out bounties for the heads of more than 600,000 squirrels. 600,000 in one colony, in a single year. That's not a rare backyard visitor. That's a population so massive it was treated like a natural disaster. And when a population is that dense, it stops being just pest control. It becomes a food source too obvious to ignore. Colonists ate what they killed because letting that much free protein go to waste made no economic sense at all. Native communities across the same land had hunted squirrel for generations before European settlers arrived, using the meat, the fur, and nearly the entire animal, wasting almost nothing. By the time the United States existed as a country, squirrel wasn't an exotic food or a survivalist stunt or something you'd only eat if you had no other choice. It was one of the plainest, most ordinary meats a rural family could put on the table alongside cornbread, beans, and whatever the garden produced that season. Squirrel dishes weren't confined to one region either. Burgoo in Kentucky, Brunswick stew across Virginia and the Carolinas, squirrel and dumplings tucked into Appalachian kitchens. Different names, same core idea, repeated across an entire stretch of the country because the same animal was available almost everywhere you looked, and that ordinariness followed the country all the way into its highest office. William Henry Harrison understood exactly what that ordinariness signaled, and he used it. Running for president in 1840 against a wealthy, polished opponent, Harrison built his entire campaign around the image of the humble frontiersman. Voters in that era often traveled for hours to reach a polling place. And along the way, Harrison's campaign fed them a hearty stew built around squirrel meat, an animal every rural voter already recognized as an honest common man's food. It wasn't fine dining. That was the entire point. It said, without a single word, I eat what you eat. Decades later, Abraham Lincoln grew up on almost the same thing, not as a political symbol, but as plain survival. On the edge of the American frontier, a young Lincoln lived on cornbread and squirrel stew because that's what the land around him actually provided, and nobody at the time would have thought twice about it. Then came James Garfield, and this is where the story turns almost unbelievable. Garfield didn't eat squirrel soup only occasionally. He requested it by name, and it became so closely tied to him personally that a recipe attributed to him was later printed inside an official White House cookbook. Raised on an Ohio farm, he had hunted the animal himself as a boy, and the taste apparently never left him. When Garfield was shot in the summer of 1881 and lay dying in the White House for weeks afterward, his doctors grew desperate to get him to eat anything at all. So the White House's own dispersing officer was granted a special permit to hunt squirrels on the grounds, specifically in the hope of preparing Garfield's favorite soup one more time. Sit with that for a second. An animal you would probably never consider eating today was once considered comforting enough, familiar enough, that it became a dying president's last hope of an appetite. This wasn't confined to the 1800s either. Theodore Roosevelt, a president whose entire public image was built on rugged frontier masculinity, was documented dining on squirrel at the White House, treating it as one more expression of the wilderness ethic he built his career around. Dwight Eisenhower grew up on Brunswick stew in rural Kansas, a dish built around squirrel meat that his father hunted and his mother cooked, and he loved it enough that decades later, as president, he had White House chefs recreate his childhood version for state dinners. Even Jimmy Carter, raised in rural Georgia in the 1920s and 1930s, remembered eating fried squirrel that his mother prepared 2 or 3 times a week. So this wasn't one eccentric president with an unusual palate. This was a thread running through more than a century of American leadership, tracing straight back to the same rural, frontier food culture that nearly every family in the country once shared, whether they lived in a log cabin or a governor's mansion. Picture the range of that list for a second. A frontier lawyer, a wounded president fighting for his life, a conservationist obsessed with the wilderness, a 5-star general turned commander-in-chief, a peanut farmer from Georgia. Different centuries, different politics, different versions of power entirely. The one thing tying all of them together was a small animal that most of their eventual successors would never think to put on a plate. So what actually killed it? It wasn't that people suddenly found squirrel disgusting. Taste doesn't shift overnight. And biologically, nothing about the meat itself changed at all between Garfield's era and yours. What changed was everything around it. During the Civil War, squirrel hunting actually surged, especially across the South, because disrupted supply lines and widespread economic hardship pushed families back toward whatever they could hunt themselves. Regional dishes built specifically around squirrel, like Brunswick stew, spread through the same hardship. One story crediting its invention to a Virginia hunting camp in 1828, where a cook named Jimmy Matthews improvised a stew out of squirrel, onions, butter, and stale bread after the intended venison spoiled. The same pattern repeated during the Great Depression, when squirrel meat quietly became a survival food for struggling rural households all over again. Money was scarce. Land was often the only asset a family still had, and a forest full of free protein looked a lot more appealing than it had a decade earlier, when steady wages made a butcher shop the easier option. Notice what that pattern actually shows you. Squirrel eating didn't rise and fall with taste. It rose and fell with hardship. That's the real hinge of this entire story. As America urbanized through the 20th century and supermarkets began offering cheap, uniform, year-round meat to nearly everyone, hunting your own dinner stopped being a necessity. It became a choice, and choices carry social weight that necessities never do. Squirrel started getting quietly rebranded, not through any single decision, but through millions of small ones made at kitchen tables across the country. It shifted from a symbol of rural self-sufficiency into a signal of rural poverty instead, the exact same animal now carrying an almost opposite meaning. Traditional dishes built around it slowly swapped squirrel out for chicken or pork, the same recipe wearing a more socially acceptable disguise. By the middle of the 20th century, hunters themselves were part of the shift. Bigger, more prestigious game like deer and wild turkey became the more desirable trophy, the animal worth bragging about, while squirrel quietly slid down the list toward something closer to a beginner's pursuit, or worse, a last resort. An animal that had once been a president's favorite meal was starting to sound, to a lot of Americans, like something only a poor family in the backwoods would still bother hunting. The numbers tell the story on their own. Between 1950 and 1990, the American population grew by roughly 70 million people. The number of hunters in the country barely moved at all, staying in a narrow band of around 13 to 16 million the entire time. A 1967 collection of hunting recipes still claimed that well over 25 million pounds of squirrel meat were showing up on American tables every single year. And that same year, the state of Illinois alone reported hunters taking more than 2.5 million squirrels. The tradition hadn't vanished yet. It had simply retreated into a shrinking, aging slice of the population, while tens of millions of new Americans grew up in cities and suburbs where hunting simply wasn't part of daily life. An entire category of food skipped a generation, almost silently. Then, in the 1990s, squirrel eating took one more direct hit. Neurologists Joseph Berger and Eric Wiseman documented a small cluster of unusual neurological cases in rural Kentucky and linked them to a very specific local custom, eating squirrel brains, raising concern about a rare transmissible brain disease similar to mad cow disease. It was an extremely narrow practice, eating the brain specifically, not the meat broadly. But headlines rarely preserve that kind of nuance. The story that spread through the culture wasn't an unusual regional custom carries a specific risk. It flattened into something closer to squirrel itself, sounding dangerous, and for a food already fading from public memory, that was enough to push what remained of the tradition almost entirely underground. By the end of the century, an animal that had once fed a run of American presidents had become something you'd only encounter through a hunter you personally knew. Here's what's strange when you actually sit with all of this. Nothing about the squirrel changed. It's the same animal it always was, just as available in your local park right now, just as edible as it was in Garfield's kitchen. What changed was your proximity to where food comes from. Somewhere in the last 3 or 4 generations, most people stopped needing to know how to turn a living animal into a meal, and an entire skill set, along with the food it produced, simply stopped being passed down at the dinner table. Think about how fragile that kind of knowledge actually is. It doesn't take a law or a ban or a single dramatic event to erase a food tradition that fed a country for 2 centuries. It just takes convenience arriving at the right moment, a supermarket opening a little closer, a job pulling a family from a farm into a city, and one generation quietly deciding not to teach the next one how to hunt, clean, and cook something their own grandparents ate without a second thought. Think about what disgust actually is for a moment. It feels instinctive, almost biological, like your body just knows what counts as food and what doesn't. But disgust is mostly learned, absorbed from the people who raised you and the culture around you, not hardwired into you at birth. A child doesn't arrive in the world with an opinion about squirrel meat. Somewhere between birth and adulthood, that opinion gets installed quietly, the same way an opinion about insects, or organ meat, or unpasteurized cheese gets installed, depending on where and when you happened to grow up. Squirrel isn't even alone in this. Rabbit, once a Sunday staple in countless American homes, has drifted toward the same fate for almost identical reasons. Organ meats, like liver and kidney, once considered the most prized cuts an animal offered, now sit at the very bottom of most shopping lists if they make it onto the list at all. In each case, nothing about the biology changed. What changed was distance, the number of steps standing between you and the animal that produced your dinner. You can watch the exact same pattern happening again right now, just with different animals and different names. Writers like Hank Shaw, who has spent years documenting hunting and foraging traditions across America, describe squirrel as a kind of gateway animal, small and unintimidating enough to demystify the entire process of hunting your own food for people who never learned it growing up. And even decades after squirrel had fallen out of the mainstream, James Beard, often called the godfather of modern American cooking, still wrote about it with genuine enthusiasm in his own writing on American cuisine, treating it as an underrated classic rather than a relic nobody should touch. That's the real twist hiding underneath this whole story. The foods you consider normal were never fixed. They're just whatever your generation happened to inherit, filtered through whatever counted as necessity, status, and fear in the decades right before you were born. 200 years ago, a squirrel on your plate meant you were a practical, self-sufficient American. The same values wrapped around cornbread and a hard day's work. 100 years ago, it could still get you elected. Today, that exact same animal on that exact same plate would probably make you pause and ask if something had gone wrong in the kitchen. Same squirrel, same nutrition, same forest. The only thing that actually moved was you, 3 or 4 generations removed from the person who would have known exactly how to clean, cook, and season one without a second thought. You'll walk past a squirrel again tomorrow and you still probably won't think about eating it. But now you know that was never really about the squirrel at all. It's about how quickly a country can forget what used to feed it, one generation, one supermarket, one headline at a time. Somewhere out there, right now, another everyday food is quietly making the same trip that squirrel already made, drifting from necessity toward memory without anyone deciding it on purpose. You won't notice it happening either. Nobody ever does, until 100 years from now, someone looks back and finds it just as strange as you find a president's squirrel soup today.